to cover objective number 2 for Chapter 29, Monetary Policy. So objective number 2 is to understand the structure of the Fed as a quasi-governmental agency. So I'm going to give you a sort of a schematic here of the structure of the Fed as it exists today. The backdrop for this is the establishment of the Fed in 1913. I think you have to remember that in 1913, this was before the Great Depression, it was before the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and it was before our more modern understanding of the way that monetary policy works in the economy. And so originally, the Fed was established largely to help avoid runs on the banking system and the collapse of the banking system if people started some type of a banking crisis. Everybody showed up at the bank at the same time and they wanted to get their deposits out. The Fed would be there as a lender of last resort. The role of the Fed and the way that the Fed conducts monetary policy is something that does, and understanding how that's sort of evolved and changed over time is a story that deserves really a course all by itself. But suffice it to say that many of the things that we talked about in class would inform that story, such as the Great Depression and the development of Keynesian economics and then the classical response to the development of Keynesian economics. So the structure of the Fed then, actually before I get to the structure of the Fed here, let me just mention a few of the responsibilities of the Fed. So the Fed conducts monetary policy much in the way, conventional monetary policy, much in a way that's consistent with what we did in the last video, where we had the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and changed the money supply and shifted the aggregate demand curve around. And the Fed's, constantly looking at their monetary policy in relation to those two potentially contradictory goals of achieving a target rate of unemployment and a target inflation rate of 2%, right? So in addition to that type of conventional monetary policy, which the Fed is thinking about on a day-to-day basis, the Fed is also responsible for monitoring the health of the U.S. economy by collecting quality data. And so they do this by having a number of different regional banks throughout the country, and each regional bank is sort of responsible for reporting back to Washington, D.C. what the economic conditions in their region look like, and all that information is taken together to decide the course of monetary policy. So the Fed is responsible for that, right? These regional banks that I'm going to talk to you about are responsible for monitoring the health of the economy, and sort of taking the temperature of the economy within their own region. Okay, so the Board of Governors in Washington, they're overseeing these 12 regional banks here. And these regional banks are sort of reporting back to Washington on economic conditions within their own region. Okay. Other responsibilities of the Fed are to do good quality research with that data that they collect. And of course, the Fed is also responsible, as we'll see more of in the next chapter, they're responsible for regulating the banking system. So the Fed has a lot of these different responsibilities and these different roles, and they're all important. What we're going to concentrate on in this chapter is conventional monetary policy. And so we're really going to be talking about, later on in the third objective, we're going to be talking about the 3 ways that the Fed goes about changing reserves in the banking system in order to increase and decrease the money supply. So the structure of the Fed then, getting back to the graphic here, there are 7 members of what's called the Board of Governors of the Fed, and they're appointed by the President. So the President gets to make the appointment, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. And once you're confirmed to sit on the Board of Governors, you get to sit as on the Board of Governors for 14 years, and you can't be removed. So if the President doesn't like the way you think about policy, he can't simply just remove you from the Board of Governors of the Fed. This helps give the Federal Reserve some autonomy in conducting monetary policy. So only the Fed conducts monetary policy. The President and Congress, they have no control over direct control over monetary policy. Their control is indirect in terms of making these appointments to the Fed and confirming them. But once the members of the board are chosen, they are free to conduct monetary policy without the political influence of Congress and the president. That's very important for establishing monetary policy credibility for the Fed, which is something I'm going to talk more about under objective number 3. So that's what I mean by sort of quasi-governmental. There's only indirect control and a longer-term perspective here that Congress and the president have over the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. And it is the Fed alone, with their understanding of the way the economy works. There are a lot of very well-trained professional economists who work at the Fed, with their arsenal of macroeconomic, econometric models that they use to do forecasting, and their sort of economic and institutional perspective, and their goals of looking at the unemployment rate and the inflation rate in order to conduct monetary policy free from whatever political biases might potentially enter into the conduct of monetary policy through Congress or the president. And that's really important to understand. Okay, so they're overseeing these 12 Federal Reserve regions, and each one of these regional banks has their own president, and then each one of these regions can have potentially branch banks, and there are 25 of these branch banks. We'll take a look at those branch banks and regions on the next slide in a map. So anyway, getting back to finishing this slide here, we've got the Federal Open Market Committee at the bottom of the slide. So what happens is, from the Board of Governors, okay, so up here with the 7 members of the Board of Governors, every one of those 7 members is always going to sit on what's called the Federal Open Market Committee, okay? All 7 of them, okay? And then there are going to be some presidents from the regional banks who also sit on this Federal Open Market Committee. There are going to be 5 of them. And it's going to rotate which 5 of the presidents of the regional banks get to sit on this key committee of the Fed, the Federal Open Market Committee. It kind of rotates around, with the exception of one. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York always gets to sit as a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee. Why? Well, because New York is considered to be sort of the financial heart of the U.S. economy. And so there's a sort of a special provision whereby the president of the New York Fed always gets to sit on this very important committee. So that's the makeup of the committee. Of course, the person who really oversees the committee is the chairman of the Fed. That's now Jay Powell. And he is one of the 7 members appointed, but then out of these 7 members, the president can elect one of them to sit as the chairman of the Fed. The chairman of the Fed is a very powerful person in Washington, often called the second most powerful person in the United States, because they really oversee this process of monetary policy. And so he will be selected amongst the 7 members of the Board of Governors by the president, and then confirmed again by the Senate to sit as the chair for a 4-year term, which can be renewed until his time as a member of the Board of Governors has expired. Now, if they are not reconfirmed, they can stay on the Board of Governors, but that's not typically what happens, right? For example, Janet Yellen could stay on the Board of Governors if she has time left in her term. I don't remember if she does or not. But she could, but she, like others, would typically choose to just step down after serving as the chairman of the Board of Governors. So what does this Federal Open Market Committee do? What do they actually do? Well, they determine the course of monetary policy. They meet, roughly every 8 weeks or so, and they review all of the data that the 12 regional banks have put together, and they look at interest rates, and they look at their target rate of unemployment relative to the actual rate of unemployment. They look at where inflation and inflationary pressures are headed relative to that 2% target, and they decide whether or not monetary policy should be neutral and they should not change interest rates, whether interest rates should be raised because we're operating beyond potential GDP and we're in an inflationary gap. The bigger the inflationary gap that they perceive, the more aggressively they will raise interest rates. That's what they're doing right now. The perception at the Federal Reserve and in the Open Market Committee right now is that the economy is operating well beyond potential GDP, or maybe not well beyond potential GDP, but certainly in an inflationary gap, and an inflationary gap that might be increasing because of tax policy and because of spending policy in Congress. And they're getting ready to raise interest rates. They've done it once already. They may do it several more times this year. And if they perceive that inflationary gap is opening up more quickly, they'll raise rates more aggressively. If we were in a recessionary gap, the way we were when President Obama took the White House, 9 years ago, then the Fed would be looking at the unemployment rate primarily, because there wasn't a lot of inflationary pressures, and they would be lowering interest rates aggressively, which they did, all the way down to the zero interest lower bound, which is a topic for the next chapter. Okay. So the Federal Open Market Committee then meets, roughly once every couple of months, once every 8 weeks or so, and they talk about the economy, and they decide, and they vote. These are all voting members. The 5 bank presidents and the 7 members of the Board of Governors are all voting members. All the presidents of the regional banks can be there, right? All of their banks will report to the Federal Open Market Committee. They can all voice their opinion, but then the course of monetary policy will be determined by the voting members of the Federal Open Market Committee. That's the key monetary policy making committee of the Federal Reserve System. So where does this relate to objective number 1? This is the committee that determines whether or not we increase M, right, or we decrease M in that first step of looking at how monetary policy impacts aggregate demand. This is the committee that makes that determination. Okay, here's a map of the different regional banks and the numbers that show up in each one of these regional banks. For example, there's a regional bank out here, San Francisco Regional Bank. There's one in Kansas City. It's called the Kansas City Regional Bank, the Dallas Regional Bank, right? Locally here, we've got the Richmond Regional Bank, okay, and the Philly Regional Bank up here. Okay, New York, Boston. Okay, so we've got these different regional banks, and what you'll notice is that there's a number that's attached with each one of these. These are the number of branch banks that are within each region, and what you'll see is that for the most part, the branch banks, there aren't very many of them on the East Coast, but there are a lot more of them on the West Coast. And that's because the Fed was established in 1913. And in 1913, the population on the West Coast was a lot less relative to the population on the East Coast than is the case today. So as populations grew and different metropolitan areas and cities kind of grew and popped up on the West Coast, we needed more branch banks to serve those areas. So rather than restructuring the entire Federal Reserve System, we just added more and more branch banks to the West Coast regional banks. So there's a map of the Federal Reserve System. Okay. So again, monetary policy is a policy of influencing the economy by changing the banking system's reserves that influence the money supply, credit availability, and interest rates in the economy. Right, and I want to emphasize this. So fiscal policy is controlled by the government directly. So fiscal policy is changing taxes and government spending that moves the aggregate demand curve. That is what the President and Congress do through their budgeting process. This is not under the control of the Federal Reserve System, but they use current budget deficits, spending and tax policy, and projections of those policies in deciding the course of monetary policy. Monetary policy, though, is controlled, in this country at least, solely by the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed. Okay, they conduct monetary policy, and they're largely free from the influence of Congress and the President in deciding on the course of interest rates. They have a lot of autonomy, which I think is very important for their credibility. Monetary policy, again, works through its influence on credit conditions and interest rates in the economy.